sleeve over on the right arm. So going back to our body base mesh here, I'm going to mask out the portion that I want to extract to use as the sleeve. So extract, I'm turning down the thickness to 0.001, giving me a pretty thin mesh. Then Control Shift tap on the mesh and delete it, and getting rid of the underlying and the trim faces. Now with this just single-sided surface, I'm going to run the polish by group, cleaning the outline a little bit more just to get it smoother. So when I am doing the Z remesher process right here, it's going to give me a cleaner mesh. It looks pretty uniform. Oh, because I don't want to deal with thickness yet. Whenever there is a object that is organic, or I know that I will go through a bunch of iterations with my scope, I tend to not use the panel loop method just yet. I will have it stay as Dynamesh so that I can play with the scope and not worry about the underside of the fabric. So eventually, either I will finish out the scope, remeshing it to get proper subdivision level, or I will go through Marvelous and create an actual piece of clothing. But for now, with the block out, because I just want to see roughly how big everything should be, what are the general shapes for the individual objects, just going to keep it loose and quick. Using a clay brush, just quickly add in some striation with the wrinkles. There's an interesting overlap of the cuff. Just really quickly roughing in the shape. Don't want to spend too much time dealing with the sculpting just yet. As long as it looks good enough, we can go ahead and move on to the next object. Going back down to the knee armor, there are two big pieces of geo that contributes to the silhouette also. So I'm going to go to my knee armor base mesh and then mask out generally what that piece of geo looks like and extrude out a shape to work with. Extract, then, and this time I'm going to invert the mask so it's masking the underside. Control tap on the mesh, it will soften out the masking. And I'm just pulling the front shape. The front faces out to give myself more thickness. For this one, because I plan on having it pretty loose, the shapes are not going to be precise yet. There are still some adjustments to be done because the actual position and rotation of the knee armor, I haven't confirmed it yet. So I just want something in place with the silhouette so I can play with all the pieces pretty quickly. And then the later lessons, I will actually make it look better. Let's move on to the boots. I'm gonna do the same thing with the leg base mesh. Going to duplicate it and cut out the section to use for the boots. So rename that duplicate. I'm going to use the knife curve brush and chop off the section that are not needed. So now I only have the feet section. Dynamesh it. Going to fill it in with a different color so it's more readable. And then with the manipulator, you can control drag to inflate your geometry. Now I'm using the transpose tool, using that first circle, click and drag, it will give me a crop. It's keeping the shoe bottom flat on the ground. And using the move brush to pull out the profile of the shoe. The top of the boot has a pretty thick cuff covering, so I'm going to duplicate my shoe base mesh and then use the knife curve brush and cut out the bottom section, leaving me with just this cylindrical geo. So inflate it a little bit more and then shape it into place. It's a good idea to separate out objects when it makes sense. I usually try not to sculpt something complicated on a single geo. For the belt, we're just going to cheat a little bit with the block out object, inserting a cylindrical object here. I'm going to use this as a placeholder belt. Smoothing it into place. I'm using the insert mesh brush. It's called IMM Primitive. Fill in a different color to read it more clearly. For the rolled up pan section, I'm going to do the same thing as I did with the boot cuff section. I duplicated my pants geo and then just isolated the bottom section there and run it through Dynamesh. So now this is a separate subtool that is the rolled up pan leg. Always keep an eye out on if you have the group function turned on. It's going to give you some unwanted results if you have extra groups on your geo. Here I'm using the knife curve brush just to cut out a cleaner surface, keeping it a little bit sharper. Using trim dynamic brush and crack brush, I'm going to do a similar thing as I did on the shirt collar as before, just very quickly roughing in the direction of the wrinkles. For the pants as well, filling out the volume. Using the clay brush to just mapping out the general wrinkle flow. For the bottom section, imagine there to be a bit more tension and folds from gravity with the fabric stacking on itself. Over on the back of the knee as well. Here I'm just mapping out all the tension lines. We have the front of the thighs there that will be stretching out the fabric. They act as a support point underneath the fabric, and in between support points, you will have tension lines. Just keeping that in mind, I'm using the clay brush to start building volume and also just sketching out roughly how I want the fabric sculpt to look like. It's working super fast and loose right here. I am working zoomed out so I don't get lost or distracted with trying to get a pretty scope in. So keeping an eye out on the silhouette for the pans. For the last bit here, we're gonna get the glove in. So I'm going back to the body base mesh using the mask lasso brush, drawing out that section where I will extract out a glove. So obviously have to take some time and define the border a little bit more, cleaning up the edges. It's just going to extend the finger hole section a little bit further. Making sure there aren't any jagged lines. Then go through extract, a thin piece of geometry. Same process as before. I'm going to Control Shift tap on the mesh, delete hidden, get rid of all the underlying faces there. Just with a single piece of geo, gonna polish it by groups, smoothing out the outline, then run through ZRemesh. This will give me a simplified and cleaner geometry. So since the glove is a pretty simple piece of object, this piece of geo that I'm going to extrude is just going to stay in place, and I will most likely carry it to a final scope. There's not a lot of iteration or changes that will come with the glove, such as the shapes or details aren't going to be too crazy different as I iterate. So I can use this geometry with a good topology all the way to the end. So usually for fabrics, clothing, I like to polygroup the border poly loops, giving me sort of like a trim separation. This is a good practice when your rough scope for clothing is pretty much there and you're ready to take it to final scope. So you do a remesh, and generally it's a good idea to introduce these trim groups. So when you start subdividing, you can isolate them and maybe inflate to give you an additional detail around the border of the fabric. It's a very common practice to add just a little bit more detail. So that's pretty much it with the gloves. We're gonna move on to add the last big shapes to the character's back. So he has sort of like a module with wing structure in the back. I'm going to use the insert mesh and insert a cube on the character's back and use it as a base mesh. It's not going to extract it because it's a pretty uniform and clean shape. So I insert it and then use the split and mask points to separate out that geometry. Group by normals. So ZBrush will give you a different polygroup based on the normals of the faces. So for this cube, I'm getting 6 different polygroups now all around, and run it through ZRemesh with the keep groups option turned on. This will allow me to keep the groups and also a cleaner geometry. So it's still not low enough for me. I'm switching to use the Z Modeler brush, and by default, with the edge action, I can Alt tap on the edge and delete the edge loops, just giving me a super simple cube. Don't need to mess with too many vertices just yet. We'll start scaling and positioning it into place. Going back to the Z Modeler brush, extending the geometry with the QMesh function. Here I masked out either side of the geometry because I want to have sort of like a flare and a little curvature going on with the tips there. Moving it into place, comparing it with the concept art. For the center section, it's the same procedure. I've added a simple cube. Here I'm using the move function and just moving the polygroup out, enlarging it. I'm using Alt Tab to select the faces. You will see that it turns white, and then your Z modeler function will be applied to your selected faces. So I selected the center part and pushed them out a little bit because I want sort of a bowing with the surface. And for the rest of the back, pretty much the same procedure. I duplicated the centerpiece there. I'm trying to think about how to attach this structure to the back. So this section right here is just me duplicating geometry and playing around with how it's attached. It will most likely change drastically, but for now, I definitely just need blockout geos in place so I can start more iterations later on. Since the armor it's semi-organic, so I imagine the structure in the back will still have some sort of curvature to them, combination with some planar cuts. So lastly, for the thin antenna-like objects, towards the end of the wings, just going to insert a cube. Switching to the transpose tool, I'm going to stretch out the geometry. Tap R to switch into rotate mode. It's rotating it into place. So we have pretty much all the major volumes in now, and we can take a step back. With the next video, we're going to throw this into Photoshop and take a look at our progress, comparing it with the concept art and do a paint over.